The deck is loud with laughter and polished shoes and the hiss of steam. A brass band plays on the wind. Glasses clink as a toast rises from the cabin below. Then the captain steps to the great black cannon on the spar deck, pulls the lanyard, and in the same instant, the ship tears itself open. A white flash, a hard slap of air. Iron turns to shrapnel and smoke. Men drop without a sound, others stumble into a red haze, and the proud new warship staggers on the Potomac as screams echo against the winter shore. Hours earlier, the USS Princeton had left Alexandria looking like the future. She was America's first screw-propelled warship, an experimental blend of sail and steam with her engines tucked low and safe, turning a hidden propeller that didn't break the water's surface. Politicians and their families crowded aboard to see what their Navy could do. Among them were President John Tyler, cabinet secretaries, senators, Dolly Madison, society figures, and the Gardner family from New York. The Princeton had already fired her great guns during earlier outings. Today was to be the most impressive display yet, a cruising reception to sell Congress on money for more ships. She carried two massive 12-inch muzzle-loading guns. One, originally called the Orator and nicknamed the Oregon, was the product of a newer method. Iron hoops shrunk around the breech to grip the barrel with constant pressure. It had been proof-fired again and again. The other, the Peacemaker, was a home-built rival. Heavier, thicker at the breech, handsome to look at, but rushed through proof. Captain Robert F. Stockton loved its effect on visitors. Fired with a measured charge, it spoke with a deep thunder that rolled over the river and came back as applause. On the morning run down the Potomac, the captain fired several salutes, and each blast drew cheers. The deck filled with dignitaries, pointing and smiling, the Marine band striking up as if this were a floating ballroom. The ship turned for home with the winter sun low and George Washington's Mount Vernon ahead. The plan was to pay respect. One last shot in view of the first president's house. Many guests drifted below deck for lunch, where the wine was warm, the air close, and the president held court. A handful returned topside for the final spectacle. Witnesses remembered the captain taking aim, crouched near the breech with the firing lanyard in hand. They remembered the seconds stretching quiet. They remembered the instant the cannon burst. The Peacemaker's left side shattered. A fan of iron, splinters, and flame cut through the crowd. The concussion shoved men against railings and tore hats into the water. When the smoke thinned, the bodies resolved. Secretary of State Abel P. Upshur lay dead. Secretary of the Navy Thomas W. Gilmer lay dead. Commodore Beverly Kennan, Chief of the Navy's Bureau of Construction Equipment and Repairs, lay dead. Virgil Maxey of Maryland, a longtime public servant and diplomat, lay dead. David Gardner, lawyer and former New York State Senator, lay dead. An enslaved young man from the president's household, recorded in newspapers as Armistead, sometimes as Henry Armistead, also died from the blast. Around them, roughly 20 others were wounded, including Stockton himself and Senator Thomas Hart Benton. The president survived because he had gone below to the cabin. He would later be seen helping to steady the shaken and directing the stunned crew to make for shore. The celebration in an instant had become a triage scene. Surgeons hurried across a deck still littered with twisted metal and torn wood. Sailors laid coats over the dead. The band fell silent. Passengers wept or stared into space, unwilling or unable to speak. The ship's engines kept their rhythm as if nothing had happened, pushing the Princeton north through a rain of ash and grit. Far off, the riverbanks were quiet, winter trees bare against a gray sky that offered no hint of the violence that had just taken place. Word outran the ship. By the time she reached the Navy Yard, messengers had carried the news into Washington. The capital, which had sent out its most important men for an afternoon of music and novelty, received them back as casualties. The East Room of the White House became a chamber of mourning. Coffins were laid in rows. Flags hung still. The city filed past, faces gray with shock, to pay respects to leaders who had died not in battle but on a pleasure cruise meant to prove American progress. The investigation began at once. A naval court of inquiry moved quickly, and within a week cleared Captain Stockton and his crew of wrongdoing. The report emphasized the quality of the English-made Oregon gun and treated the Peacemaker's failure as an industrial calamity, an accident of material and method. Another inquiry by the Franklin Institute looked harder at the Peacemaker's construction and the decision to rely on thickness rather than the hooping technique that pre-stressed the metal at the breech. The lesson, written in blood and iron fragments, was that showmanship is not a substitute for proof. Manufacturing standards would evolve. Names like Rodman and Dahlgren would come to stand for stronger, safer artillery. But on that winter day, the price for learning had already been paid. Politics shifted in the blast's wake. With Upshur gone, the Texas Annexation Treaty lost its most committed advocate in the State Department. John C. Calhoun, who replaced him, took a different approach that slowed the timetable and changed the debate in an election year. The Navy Department passed to John Y. Mason after Gilmer's death. In a capital that ran on relationships, the sudden loss of 2 cabinet officers in a single instant rippled through every corridor. Personal lives turned on that hinge as well. David Gardner's daughter, Julia, had been below when the gun burst. She fainted when told her father was dead. President Tyler carried her from the ship. In the months that followed, through grief, through public scrutiny, through the awkward fact of a large age gap, Julia agreed to marry the widowed president. They wed in June 1844, the first presidential marriage while in office, and went on to have 7 children. Some would always remember that the courtship had been sealed in the shadow of a gun that failed. For the Princeton, reputation never recovered. She remained in service for a few years, sailed with the home squadron, and later to the Mediterranean, but the name was stamped forever by a single deck-level disaster. The ship had marked a leap forward in propulsion and layout, with engines protected below the waterline and a propeller that promised speed and efficiency. Yet her public identity was fixed to the Peacemaker, an object lesson in how one design choice, one shortcut in testing, can end a career, stain a command, and change lives. Stand on the riverbank where the blast rolled across the water, and you can still imagine the sequence. The low gray of late winter, the spike of noise that hits you in the chest, the immediate quiet when every voice is knocked out of the air, then the confusion, band members dropping instruments, sailors running with buckets and stretchers, smoke swirling off the deck like fog lifting from the Potomac's cold surface. You can see the stunned men at the rail and the captain, soot-streaked and bleeding, trying to form the words that will steady a panicked ship. What happened that day was not a battle and not an act of sabotage. It was the kind of peacetime catastrophe that tests institutions, crafts new rules, and leaves small human markers everywhere it passes. A widow's letter in a family trunk, a cabinet portrait with a black ribbon tied across the corner, a monument inscription that lists dates without explaining the sound that made them necessary. The Princeton kept moving under power until the crew could set her lines ashore. Washington kept moving under power, too, replacing chairs, rewriting orders, and pressing on with business. But for the families of the dead and injured, the afternoon never ended. The Peacemaker's fragments were cleaned away, the deck replanked, the band's sheet music gathered and boxed. The river went back to its flat winter course. The Navy went on to build better guns and better ships. The country crossed into an age where steel, steam, and industrial discipline would decide whether a demonstration dazzled or killed. The promise and the warning were welded together on a single February day in 1844. Thank you for listening to The Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.